The autumn wind of 1842 swept through Nauvoo, Illinois, carrying with it the scent of burning leaves and the whispered prayers of the faithful. In the heart of this thriving Mormon settlement stood the imposing Smith Mansion, its white columns gleaming in the pale October sunlight like pillars of divine authority. Behind its pristine facade, Joseph Smith Jr., the self-proclaimed prophet of God, conducted his earthly affairs with the same fervor he reserved for his heavenly revelations. Sarah Whitman pressed her trembling hands against her dark wool dress as she approached the mansion's ornate front door. At 17, she possessed the kind of innocent beauty that drew lingering glances from the men of Nauvoo. Golden hair that caught the light like spun silk and eyes the color of prairie wildflowers. Her father, Brother Whitman, had received a divine revelation through the prophet just 3 days prior. Sarah was to be sealed to Joseph Smith in a sacred ceremony that would bind their souls for eternity. "The Lord has chosen you, daughter," her father had whispered, his weathered hands shaking as he delivered the message. "Brother Joseph says you are to be prepared for a celestial marriage. It is God's will." The heavy oak door opened before Sarah could knock, revealing Brigham Young's stern countenance. His dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, as if he were appraising livestock rather than greeting a fellow believer. "Sister Whitman," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "the prophet awaits you in the upper chamber. You are to speak of this to no one. Not your mother, not your sisters, not even in your prayers. What transpires here tonight is sacred beyond mortal understanding." Sarah nodded, though her throat felt as dry as summer dust. She had heard whispers among the women of Nauvoo, hushed conversations that ceased whenever she drew near, meaningful glances exchanged between wives whose husbands held positions of authority in the church. Something was happening in this house, something that made even the most devout women lower their voices and cross themselves when they thought no one was watching. The mansion's interior was a testament to the prosperity that divine favor could bring. Rich carpets from the east covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of biblical scenes adorned the walls. But as Brigham led her up the grand staircase, Sarah noticed details that seemed oddly out of place in a holy man's home. Heavy curtains that blocked out all natural light, doors fitted with unusual locks, and a persistent scent of burning herbs that reminded her of the folk remedies her grandmother had once used to ward off evil spirits. They stopped before a door at the end of the hallway, its surface carved with symbols Sarah didn't recognize, intertwining circles and strange geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering candlelight. "Remember," Brigham whispered, his breath hot against her ear, "what you experience tonight is a sacred ordinance. To speak of it would be to invite damnation upon yourself and your family. The prophet's word is God's word, and God's word is law." The door opened, and Sarah found herself face to face with Joseph Smith himself. At 36, the prophet possessed a commanding presence that had drawn thousands to his cause. His dark hair was carefully groomed. His blue eyes held an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul, and his smile carried the warmth of a father welcoming home a beloved child. "Sister Sarah," he said, extending his hand to her, "come, child. The Lord has great plans for you." The room beyond was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Candles flickered from every surface, casting dancing shadows on walls draped with rich fabrics in deep purples and golds. At the center of the room stood an altar of polished wood, its surface covered with a white cloth embroidered with the same strange symbols she had seen on the door. The air was thick with incense, and somewhere in the shadows she could hear the soft sound of women's voices humming a melody she didn't recognize. "Do not be afraid," Joseph said, guiding her toward the altar. "What we do here tonight is as old as Adam and Eve, as sacred as the union between Christ and his church." You have been chosen, Sarah, selected by divine revelation to participate in the most holy of ordinances. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Sarah began to make out other figures in the room. Women dressed in white robes stood in the shadows, their faces hidden behind veils of the finest silk. She recognized the silhouette of Eliza Snow, one of Joseph's most devoted followers, and thought she glimpsed the familiar form of Zena Huntington, though she couldn't be certain in the flickering candlelight. "The celestial marriage," Joseph continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence he used during his most powerful sermons, "is not merely a union of souls, but a joining of flesh that mirrors the divine love between God and his creation. Tonight, you will learn the sacred mysteries that have been hidden from the world since the time of Solomon." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as Joseph began to remove his coat, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. She wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of her father's house, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. The women in the shadows began to hum louder, their voices weaving together in a harmony that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. "The world would not understand," Joseph said, his eyes never leaving hers as he loosened his collar. "They would call it sin, but they do not possess the keys to the kingdom as I do. What is forbidden to the Gentiles is commanded of the saints. What appears as transgression to the uninitiated is, in truth, the highest form of worship." The prophet's hands were warm as they touched her shoulders, and Sarah felt a strange lethargy creeping through her limbs. The incense seemed thicker now, almost narcotic in its intensity, and the humming of the hidden women had taken on an hypnotic quality that made her thoughts feel sluggish and distant. "Trust in the Lord," Joseph whispered, his fingers beginning to work at the buttons of her dress. "Trust in his prophet. What we do here tonight will seal your salvation for all eternity." As the last of the daylight faded beyond the heavy curtains, Sarah Whitman crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. In the mansion that the faithful called a house of God, she would learn that some revelations came with a price that could never be fully paid, and some sacred ordinances left stains on the soul that no amount of prayer could ever wash clean. The candles flickered, the women hummed their ancient melody, and in the heart of Nauvoo, another young woman discovered that the line between salvation and damnation was sometimes drawn in places where no mortal eye could see. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah Whitman's celestial sealing, and the autumn of 1842 had settled over Nauvoo like a shroud. The young woman moved through her daily routines like a sleepwalker, her once bright eyes now holding shadows that seemed to deepen with each passing day. She spoke little, ate less, and spent long hours staring out her bedroom window toward the Smith mansion, as if trying to convince herself that what had happened there was nothing more than a fevered dream. But dreams, Sarah had learned, did not leave physical reminders. Dreams did not explain the bruises that had taken weeks to fade, or the way her body still ached in places she had never known could hurt. Dreams certainly did not account for the monthly bleeding that had failed to come, or the nausea that gripped her each morning like the hand of an angry god. Emma Smith stood at the window of her own bedroom in the mansion, watching the Whitman house with eyes that had seen too much and understood even more. At 38, the prophet's wife had learned to read the signs, the way young women walked differently after their sealings, the haunted look that crept into their eyes, the way they flinched when men drew too near. She had seen it in Fanny Alger, in Lucinda Harris, in Zena Huntington, and now in poor Sarah Whitman. "Another lamb for the slaughter," Emma whispered to herself, her breath fogging the cold glass. She had tried, in the early days of these celestial marriages, to convince herself that Joseph's revelations were genuine. The doctrine of plural marriage, he claimed, had been revealed to him by an angel with a flaming sword who threatened destruction if the practice was not restored. But Emma had been married to Joseph long enough to recognize the difference between divine inspiration and earthly desire, and what she had witnessed in recent months bore no resemblance to the sacred ordinances described in Scripture. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. "Come!" she called, turning from the window. The door opened to reveal Eliza Snow, one of Joseph's most devoted followers, and, Emma knew with bitter certainty, one of his most recent celestial wives. Eliza's face bore the serene expression of the truly faithful, but Emma had learned to look deeper, to see the cracks in the facade that even the most devoted believers couldn't entirely hide. "Sister Emma," Eliza said, her voice carrying its usual musical quality, "the prophet requests your presence in his study. He says there are household matters to discuss." Emma's stomach tightened. Joseph's household matters had become increasingly difficult to stomach as his appetites grew more elaborate and his justifications more creative. But she was still his wife, still bound by the vows she had taken before God and man, even if those vows seemed to mean less to Joseph with each passing revelation. "Tell him I'll be down presently," Emma replied, her voice carefully neutral. After Eliza departed, Emma made her way through the mansion's familiar corridors, noting details that had once brought her pride, but now filled her with a creeping sense of dread. The expensive furnishings, the imported fabrics, the oil paintings of biblical scenes, all of it paid for by the tithes and offerings of faithful saints who believed their prophet lived a life of humble devotion. Joseph's study was located on the mansion's ground floor, behind a door that was always kept locked when he was conducting his most private business. Emma found him seated behind his massive oak desk, reviewing what appeared to be a list of names written in his careful script. He looked up as she entered, his blue eyes holding that familiar mixture of charm and calculation that had first attracted her to him 20 years ago. "Emma, my dear," he said, rising to greet her with a kiss on the cheek that felt as cold as winter rain. "I trust you're well as can be expected," she replied, taking the chair across from his desk. "Eliza said you wished to discuss household matters." Joseph's smile faltered slightly, and Emma caught a glimpse of something darker beneath his prophet's mask. "Indeed. I've received another revelation, Emma. The Lord has shown me that our arrangements require certain modifications." Emma's hands clenched in her lap. "What sort of modifications?" "The celestial ceilings have been blessed by heaven," Joseph continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence he used when delivering revelations. "But the Lord has made it clear that these sacred ordinances require a more private setting, a place where the faithful can commune with divinity without fear of interruption or misunderstanding." He gestured toward a section of the study's wall that Emma had never paid particular attention to before. Now, looking more closely, she could see that the wood paneling was slightly different in color and grain, as if it had been recently installed. "I've had the workers construct a special chamber," Joseph explained, moving to the wall and pressing his hand against what appeared to be a solid panel. To Emma's amazement, the section swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow doorway that led into darkness. A place where the most sacred ordinances can be performed without fear of discovery by those who lack the spiritual maturity to understand. Emma rose from her chair on unsteady legs, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Joseph, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that the Lord has commanded me to expand the practice of celestial marriage," he replied, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "There are young women in Nauvoo who have been chosen for this sacred calling, Emma. Girls whose spiritual development requires the guidance that only a true prophet can provide." The hidden door yawned before them like the mouth of a tomb, and Emma could smell the same cloying incense that had begun to permeate the upper floors of the mansion. Somewhere in that darkness, she could hear the sound of women's voices, though whether they were praying or weeping she couldn't tell. "The Partridge sisters have already been sealed to me," Joseph continued, his voice growing more animated as he spoke of his revelations. Emily and Eliza, both of them pure vessels, ready to receive the fullness of celestial glory, and young Helen Kimball, barely 14, but the Lord has shown me that her spiritual development requires immediate attention. Emma felt bile rise in her throat. Helen Kimball was a child, a sweet girl who still played with dolls and braided flowers in her hair. The thought of that innocent child being subjected to Joseph's celestial ordinances made Emma's vision blur with rage and horror. "You cannot be serious," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. "The Lord's ways are not man's ways, Emma," Joseph replied, his tone growing stern. "What appears as transgression to the carnal mind is revealed as righteousness to those who possess the keys of the kingdom. These young women are being prepared for exaltation, for a glory that surpasses mortal understanding." He moved closer to the hidden doorway, and Emma could see that the darkness beyond was not complete. Flickering candlelight danced on walls that appeared to be draped with rich fabrics, and she could make out the shapes of furniture that seemed oddly ceremonial in nature. "Would you like to see?" Joseph asked, extending his hand toward her. "Would you like to witness the sacred chamber where heaven and earth unite in perfect harmony?" Emma stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a serpent poised to strike. In that moment, she understood with crystal clarity that she stood at a crossroads that would define not only her own fate, but the fate of every young woman in Nauvoo who caught her husband's eye. She could step through that doorway and become complicit in whatever horrors lay beyond, or she could turn away and face the consequences of defying a man who claimed to speak for God himself. The voices from the hidden chamber grew louder, and Emma thought she could distinguish individual words now, pleas perhaps, or prayers offered in desperation rather than devotion. The sound made her skin crawl and her maternal instincts flare like a fire in her chest. "No," she said, stepping back from the doorway. "No, Joseph, I will not be part of this." The prophet's expression darkened, and for a moment Emma saw him not as the charismatic leader who had won her heart, but as something far more dangerous, a predator who had learned to disguise his hunger as holiness. "Then you choose to stand against the Lord's anointed," he said, his voice carrying a threat that made Emma's blood run cold. "You choose to oppose the very revelations that will bring salvation to the faithful." Emma met his gaze without flinching, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. "I choose to oppose what I know in my heart to be wrong, regardless of what revelations you claim to justify it." The hidden door swung shut with a soft click, sealing away whatever secrets lay beyond. But Emma knew that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed again. The knowledge of what her husband had become would haunt her for the rest of her days, and the weight of the young women's suffering would press upon her conscience like a stone upon her chest. As she left Joseph's study, Emma Smith began to plan. If she could not stop her husband's predations directly, perhaps she could find another way to protect the innocent girls of Nauvoo. But she would have to be careful, very careful indeed. In a community where the prophet's word was law, speaking against him was tantamount to speaking against God himself. And the price of such blasphemy, Emma knew, could be higher than any mortal soul could bear to pay. The November wind howled through the streets of Nauvoo like the voice of an angry god, rattling windows and sending dead leaves skittering across the frozen ground. In the Partridge household, 16-year-old Emily sat by the dying embers of the fireplace, her needle moving mechanically through the fabric of a dress she was mending for her younger sister. The repetitive motion helped calm her nerves, though nothing could entirely banish the dread that had settled in her stomach like a cold stone. 3 days had passed since her father, Bishop Edward Partridge, had received the revelation. 3 days since he had gathered his family in their modest parlor and announced with tears streaming down his weathered face that the Lord had chosen both Emily and her sister Eliza for a sacred calling that would elevate their family to the highest levels of celestial glory. "The prophet has received a revelation concerning you girls," he had said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You are to be sealed to brother Joseph in the new and everlasting covenant. It is the greatest honor that could be bestowed upon our family." Emily's needle slipped, pricking her finger and sending a drop of blood onto the white fabric. She stared at the crimson stain, thinking of how some marks could never be washed clean, no matter how hard one scrubbed or how many tears were shed in the attempt. Across the room, her sister Eliza sat at their mother's writing desk, composing what she claimed was a letter to their aunt in Missouri. But Emily had seen the way Eliza's hand trembled as she wrote, had noticed how she kept glancing toward the window that faced the Smith mansion, and had heard her sister crying softly into her pillow each night since their father's announcement. Their mother, Lydia Partridge, moved through the house like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, her eyes holding a haunted quality that reminded Emily of the women who had lost children to the fever that had swept through Nauvoo the previous summer. She spoke little, ate less, and spent long hours in prayer, though Emily suspected she was pleading with God to release her daughters from their sacred calling rather than blessing it. A sharp knock at the front door made all three women freeze. Emily's needle stopped mid-stitch. Eliza's pen hovered over her letter, and their mother's hands clenched around the dish towel she had been using to dry the supper plates. "I'll answer it," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily heard the front door open, followed by the sound of her mother's sharp intake of breath. A man's voice, smooth and authoritative, drifted through the house. Brigham Young come to collect them for their celestial sealing. "Sister Partridge," Brigham said, his tone carrying the weight of divine authority. "The prophet awaits your daughters. They are to come immediately, and they are to bring nothing with them save their faith and their willingness to serve the Lord." Emily's hands began to shake so violently that she had to set down her sewing. Beside her, Eliza had gone completely still, her face as white as the paper beneath her pen. "Must it be tonight?" their mother asked, and Emily could hear the desperation in her voice. Could they not have one more day to prepare themselves spiritually? "The Lord's timing is not subject to mortal convenience," Brigham replied, his voice growing stern. "The revelation has been given, and it must be fulfilled." "Would you have your daughters disobey a direct commandment from God himself?" Emily rose from her chair on unsteady legs, knowing that further delay would only make their situation worse. In Nauvoo, questioning the prophet's revelations was tantamount to apostasy, and apostates faced consequences that extended far beyond spiritual condemnation. "Come, Eliza," she said, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "We must not keep the prophet waiting." The sisters embraced their mother in the hallway, and Emily felt Lydia's tears dampening her hair. "Remember who you are," their mother whispered, her voice breaking. "Remember that you are daughters of God, no matter what is asked of you." The walk to the Smith mansion felt like a funeral procession. Brigham led them through the darkened streets, his lantern casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach for them with grasping fingers. Emily held Eliza's hand tightly, feeling her sister's pulse racing beneath her skin like a trapped bird. The mansion loomed before them, its windows glowing with warm light that should have been welcoming, but instead felt ominous and threatening. Brigham led them not to the front door, but around to a side entrance that Emily had never noticed before. The door opened at their approach, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into what appeared to be the mansion's cellar. "The sacred chamber has been prepared," Brigham explained as they descended the wooden steps. "What you will experience tonight is known only to the most faithful of the saints. You are bound by sacred oath never to speak of these ordinances to anyone, not your parents, not your friends, not even each other, unless you are within these consecrated walls. The cellar had been transformed into something that bore no resemblance to the storage space Emily had expected. Rich tapestries covered the stone walls, and dozens of candles provided flickering illumination that cast everything in shades of gold and shadow. The air was thick with incense, and Emily could hear the sound of women's voices humming a melody that seemed both beautiful and deeply unsettling. At the center of the chamber stood an altar draped in white silk, its surface adorned with symbols that Emily didn't recognize, but that filled her with an inexplicable sense of dread. Around the altar, figures in white robes moved like ghosts, their faces hidden behind veils that made them appear more spirit than flesh. Joseph Smith emerged from the shadows, resplendent in robes of deep purple that seemed to absorb the candlelight. His presence filled the chamber with an authority that was both magnetic and terrifying, and Emily found herself unable to look away from his piercing blue eyes. "My dear sisters," he said, his voice carrying the same hypnotic quality he used during his most powerful sermons. "Welcome to the most sacred space on earth, where heaven and mortality unite in perfect harmony. Tonight, you will participate in ordinances that were known to Adam and Eve, to Abraham and his wives, to Solomon in all his glory." Emily felt Eliza's hand tighten in hers as Joseph approached them, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. The veiled women began to hum louder, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to come from another world entirely. "The celestial marriage," Joseph continued, his eyes moving between the two sisters with an intensity that made Emily's skin crawl, "is not merely a union of souls, but a joining of flesh that mirrors the divine love between Christ and his church. What the world calls sin, heaven calls sacrament. What appears as transgression to the uninitiated is, in truth, the highest form of worship." One of the veiled women approached, carrying a silver chalice filled with what appeared to be wine. The liquid was darker than any wine Emily had ever seen, almost black in the candlelight, and it gave off a sweet, cloying scent that reminded her of overripe fruit. "Drink," Joseph commanded, offering the chalice first to Emily. "Partake of the sacrament that will prepare your spirits for the sacred ordinances to come." Emily's hands shook as she accepted the chalice, and she noticed that the silver was warm to the touch, as if it had been heated over a flame. The liquid within seemed to move of its own accord, swirling in patterns that hurt her eyes to follow. I'm not certain I should," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the humming of the veiled women. Joseph's expression darkened, and Emily caught a glimpse of something predatory beneath his prophet's mask. "Do you question the Lord's anointed?" he asked, his voice carrying a threat that made Emily's blood run cold. "Do you doubt the revelations that have been given for your salvation?" Emily looked around the chamber, taking in the strange symbols, the veiled women, the altar that seemed more pagan than Christian. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to grab Eliza's hand and run from this place as fast as her legs could carry her. But she was trapped by her faith, by her family's position in the community, by the terrible weight of divine authority that Joseph wielded like a weapon. "No," she whispered, raising the chalice to her lips. "I do not question." The liquid burned as it went down, leaving a bitter aftertaste that made her stomach churn. Almost immediately, she felt a strange lethargy creeping through her limbs, and the chamber seemed to grow hazy around the edges, as if she were viewing it through a veil of smoke. Eliza drank next, and Emily watched her sister's eyes grow glassy and unfocused as the mysterious liquid took effect. The humming of the veiled women grew louder, more insistent, and Emily found herself swaying slightly as the sound seemed to penetrate her very bones. "Now," Joseph said, his voice seeming to come from very far away, "let the sacred ordinances begin." As the candles flickered and the incense grew thicker, Emily Partridge crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. In the hidden chamber beneath the Smith mansion, she would learn that some revelations came with a price that could never be fully paid, and some sacred ordinances left wounds on the soul that no amount of prayer could ever heal. The veiled women continued their haunting melody. The shadows danced on the tapestried walls, and in the heart of Nauvoo, two more young women discovered that the line between salvation and damnation was sometimes drawn in places where no mortal eye should ever have to look. December snow fell silently over Nauvoo, blanketing the town in a deceptive purity that masked the darkness festering beneath its surface. In the Smith mansion, Emma moved through the halls like a woman possessed, her mind consumed by a single desperate purpose. For weeks, she had watched young women enter her home with hope in their eyes and leave with shadows in their souls. She had seen the way they walked afterward, carefully, as if something inside them had been broken. She had heard their muffled sobs echoing through the mansion's walls in the dark hours before dawn. Tonight, while Joseph conducted another of his celestial sealings in the hidden chamber below, Emma had finally decided to act. She could no longer stand by and watch as her husband destroyed innocent lives in the name of divine revelation. If she could not stop him directly, perhaps she could at least document his crimes, preserve evidence of what was truly happening in the house that the faithful believed to be a sanctuary. Emma's hands trembled as she picked the lock on Joseph's private study, a skill she had learned years ago when her husband's secretive behavior had first begun to trouble her. The door opened with a soft click, and she slipped inside, closing it carefully behind her. The room was illuminated only by moonlight streaming through the tall windows, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Joseph's desk was a monument to his earthly ambitions, carved from the finest oak, its surface covered with correspondence from church leaders, financial documents, and the leather-bound journal where he recorded his daily revelations. Emma had seen him writing in that journal countless times, his pen moving across the pages with the fervor of a man transcribing the very words of God. But tonight, Emma was not interested in Joseph's public revelations. She was searching for something far more damning, the private records she was certain he kept, the detailed accounts of his celestial marriages that would reveal the true nature of his sacred ordinances. She began her search methodically, checking each drawer of the massive desk, running her fingers along the edges, looking for hidden compartments. Joseph was nothing if not thorough in his record-keeping, and Emma knew that somewhere in this room lay the evidence that could expose him for what he truly was. It was behind a false panel in the desk's bottom drawer that she found it. A slim volume bound in black leather, its pages filled with Joseph's careful handwriting. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she opened the journal and began to read by the pale moonlight. November 15th, 1842. The Lord has blessed me with another celestial wife. Sarah Whitman, age 17, was sealed to me this evening in the sacred chamber. Her spiritual preparation required 3 hours of instruction in the mysteries of godliness. She resisted at first, as is natural for one so young and inexperienced in the ways of heaven, but the sacred wine helped to calm her fears and open her heart to divine truth. Emma's stomach lurched as she read the clinical description of what she now understood to be systematic abuse. The sacred wine that Joseph mentioned, she had seen him preparing it herself, mixing herbs and tinctures that he claimed enhanced spiritual receptivity, but that she now realized were designed to render his victims compliant. She turned the page, her hands shaking so violently that she could barely hold the journal steady. November 28th, 1842. Emily and Eliza Partridge were both sealed to me in a single ceremony. The Lord revealed that sisters who are joined to the same priesthood holder create a spiritual bond that transcends mortal understanding. Emily required more persuasion than her sister, but both eventually submitted to the will of heaven. Their youth and purity make them ideal vessels for the reception of celestial glory. The euphemistic language could not disguise the horror of what Joseph was describing. Emma thought of the Partridge sisters, barely more than children, and felt bile rise in her throat. She forced herself to continue reading, knowing that each page brought her closer to the evidence she needed to expose her husband's crimes. December 3rd, 1842. Helen Kimball has been prepared for sealing. At 14, she represents the perfect age for celestial marriage, old enough to understand the sacred nature of the ordinances, yet young enough to be molded according to divine will. Her father, Brother Kimball, has been assured that this union will guarantee his family's exaltation in the celestial kingdom. Emma's vision blurred with tears of rage and horror. Helen Kimball was a child, a sweet girl who still played with dolls and helped her mother with the household chores. The thought of that innocent child being subjected to Joseph's sacred ordinances made Emma's entire body shake with fury. She was so absorbed in the journal's contents that she almost missed the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Emma's blood turned to ice as she realized that Joseph's ceremony must have ended earlier than expected. She could hear his voice, along with those of other men, Brigham Young, Heber Kimball, and others who had become complicit in her husband's crimes. Moving with desperate speed, Emma closed the journal and returned it to its hiding place, her fingers fumbling with the false panel as the voices grew closer. She had just managed to lock the desk drawer when the study door opened, flooding the room with lamplight. Joseph stood in the doorway, still wearing the ceremonial robes he used for his celestial sealings. His face was flushed with what Emma recognized as the aftermath of his sacred ordinances, and his eyes held a satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying a note of surprise, "what are you doing in my study at this hour?" Emma's mind raced as she searched for a plausible explanation. I was looking for the household accounts," she said, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "I wanted to review the expenses for next month's provisions." Joseph's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, and Emma could see him weighing her words, searching for signs of deception. Behind him, Brigham Young and the other men watched with expressions of barely concealed suspicion. "The household accounts are kept in the kitchen," Joseph said slowly. "They always have been." Emma felt the walls closing in around her, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with her husband. "Of course," she said, managing a weak smile. "I must be more tired than I thought. I'll retire to my room now." She moved toward the door, but Joseph's hand shot out to grasp her wrist, his fingers closing around it with bruising force. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying a warning that made her blood run cold. "I trust you understand the importance of respecting the sacred nature of the work being done in this house. Some things are too holy to be discussed, even between husband and wife." Emma met his gaze without flinching, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. "I understand perfectly, Joseph. I understand more than you might think." For a moment they stared at each other in silence, and Emma could see her husband weighing whether she posed a threat to his carefully constructed facade. Finally, he released her wrist, but his eyes never left her face. "Good," he said. "I'm glad we understand each other." Emma left the study on unsteady legs, her mind reeling from what she had discovered. The journal contained enough evidence to destroy Joseph's reputation and expose the true nature of his celestial marriages. But she also knew that possessing such knowledge put her in mortal danger. In a community where the prophet's word was law, anyone who threatened to expose his crimes would face consequences that extended far beyond social ostracism. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Emma began to formulate a plan. She could not confront Joseph directly. He was too powerful, too well protected by his devoted followers. But perhaps she could find another way to ensure that the truth would eventually come to light. Perhaps she could create her own record, her own testimony to the horrors she had witnessed. In her bedroom, Emma lit a single candle, and sat down at her writing desk. Her hand still trembled as she took up her pen, but her resolve was firm. If she could not save the young women who had already fallen victim to her husband's predations, perhaps she could at least ensure that their suffering would not be forgotten. December 10th, 1842, she wrote, her pen moving across the page with steady determination. I, Emma Smith, wife of the prophet Joseph Smith, do hereby record my testimony of the abominations that have been committed in this house under the guise of divine revelation. What follows is the truth set down by my own hand, that future generations might know the price that was paid for one man's unbridled appetites. As the candle burned lower and the night grew deeper, Emma continued to write, documenting every detail she could remember, every horror she had witnessed or suspected. She wrote of the hidden chamber, of the drugged wine, of the young women who entered her home as faithful believers and left as broken shells of their former selves. She wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes burned with exhaustion, driven by the knowledge that somewhere in Nauvoo, other young women were being prepared for their own celestial sealings. She wrote because she could not save them all, but she could at least ensure that their stories would survive, that someday someone would know the truth about what had happened in the house that the faithful called holy. And as the first light of dawn began to creep through her bedroom windows, Emma Smith finished her testimony and hid it away, knowing that she had just signed what might very well be her own death warrant. But some truths she had learned were worth dying for, especially when the alternative was living with the knowledge that she had done nothing while innocents suffered in the name of God. The spring of 1844 arrived in Nauvoo with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to mock the growing tension within the Mormon community. Rumors had begun to circulate, whispered conversations that ceased when certain ears drew near, meaningful glances exchanged between women whose husbands held positions of authority in the church. The carefully constructed facade of celestial harmony was beginning to crack, and through those cracks, the truth was starting to seep like poison into the groundwater of faith. Emma Smith stood at the window of her bedroom, watching as a group of young women walked past the mansion on their way to the temple. Among them was Helen Kimball, now 15, and bearing the hollow-eyed look that Emma had come to recognize in all of Joseph's celestial wives. The girl moved differently now, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible burden, her gaze fixed on the ground as if she could no longer bear to look at the world around her. Behind Emma, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, lay the journal she had been keeping for over a year. Page after page of testimony documenting her husband's crimes. She had written in it faithfully, recording every detail she could gather, every horror she had witnessed or suspected. The journal had become her confession, her testimony, and perhaps her only hope for redemption in a world where speaking truth had become tantamount to blasphemy. A sharp knock at her bedroom door interrupted her brooding. "Come!" she called, turning from the window. The door opened to reveal William Law, one of Joseph's former counselors in the church presidency. Law's face was haggard, his eyes holding the same haunted quality that Emma had seen in her own mirror for months. She knew why he had come. Law had been one of the few men in Nauvoo with the courage to question Joseph's revelations, and his opposition had cost him his position and his standing in the community. "Sister Emma," Law said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you about what's been happening in this house." Emma's heart began to race. Law's presence in her bedroom was dangerous for both of them. If Joseph discovered that she had been meeting with one of his most vocal critics, the consequences would be severe. But she also knew that Law might be her only ally in a community where blind faith had replaced moral judgment. "What do you want to know?" she asked, closing the door behind him and turning the key in the lock. Law's hands shook as he removed a folded paper from his coat pocket. "My wife Jane has been approached," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Brother Brigham came to our house 3 days ago with a revelation. Jane is to be sealed to the prophet in a celestial marriage. She's only 17, Emma. She's barely more than a child. Emma felt the familiar surge of rage and helplessness that had become her constant companion. And what did you tell him? I told him that I would see Joseph in hell before I allowed him to touch my wife, Law replied, his voice growing stronger with anger. But they've made it clear that my refusal will have consequences. They're threatening to excommunicate me, to brand me as an apostate. In Nauvoo, that's tantamount to a death sentence. Emma moved to her writing desk and withdrew a key from a hidden compartment. There's something you need to see, she said, kneeling beside the loose floorboard and retrieving her hidden journal. Something that might help you understand the true scope of what we're facing. Law's eyes widened as Emma opened the journal and began to read selected passages aloud. His face grew paler with each revelation, each clinical description of Joseph's sacred ordinances, each account of young women drugged and violated in the name of divine commandment. "Dear God," he whispered when Emma finished reading, "how many?" "At least 30 that I know of," Emma replied, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Probably more. He's been careful to keep detailed records. He sees himself as a latter-day Solomon, building a celestial kingdom with himself as the eternal patriarch." Law stood and began pacing the small room, his hands clenched into fists. "This has to stop, Emma. We can't allow this to continue." And how do you propose we stop it?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. "Joseph has convinced the entire community that he speaks for God. Anyone who opposes him is branded as an apostate, driven from Nauvoo or worse. We're trapped in a web of our own making." Law stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing with determination. "We expose him. We publish the truth for all to see. I've been working with others, Robert Foster, Charles Foster, Francis Higby. We're planning to start a newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor. We'll print the truth about Joseph's polygamy, about his abuse of power, about everything." Emma's blood ran cold. "William, you don't understand what you're proposing. Joseph won't simply allow you to publish accusations against him. He has the Nauvoo Legion at his disposal, hundreds of armed men who would kill for him without question. If you move against him openly, you're signing your own death warrant." Then so be it," Law replied, his voice firm with resolve. "Some things are worth dying for, Emma. The innocence of these young women is worth dying for." Emma stared at him for a long moment, seeing in his face the same desperate courage that had driven her to begin documenting Joseph's crimes. She thought of Sarah Whitman, of the Partridge Sisters, of Helen Kimball and all the others whose lives had been destroyed in the name of celestial glory. "If you're determined to do this," she said finally, "then you'll need evidence, real evidence, not just accusations and rumors." She handed him the journal, watching as he hefted its weight in his hands. "This contains everything I've been able to document over the past year and a half. Names, dates, descriptions of the ceremonies, even copies of some of Joseph's private correspondence. It's enough to destroy him if you can find a way to get it published." Law's hands trembled as he accepted the journal. "Emma, if Joseph discovers that you've given this to me, he'll kill me," Emma finished, her voice matter of fact. "I know. But I can't live with this knowledge any longer, William. I can't watch him destroy another young woman while I do nothing to stop it." Over the following weeks, Emma watched as the tension in Nauvoo reached a breaking point. Law and his associates worked feverishly to prepare their exposé, while Joseph and his followers grew increasingly paranoid about potential threats to their authority. The prophet's sermons took on a darker tone, filled with warnings about enemies within and the need for absolute loyalty to God's anointed. On June 7, 1844, the first and only edition of the Nauvoo Expositor was published. Emma read it in the privacy of her bedroom, her heart pounding as she saw her own documented evidence laid out in stark black and white for all to see. The newspaper contained detailed accounts of Joseph's polygamous marriages, descriptions of the hidden chamber and its ceremonies, and testimonies from several of his victims who had finally found the courage to speak. The reaction was swift and violent. Joseph, acting in his capacity as mayor of Nauvoo, declared the newspaper a public nuisance and ordered the printing press destroyed. The Nauvoo Legion, under his command, marched to the expositor office and smashed the press to pieces, scattering the type and burning the remaining copies of the newspaper. But the damage had been done. Word of the expositor's revelations spread beyond Nauvoo's borders, carried by travelers and traders to communities throughout Illinois and beyond. For the first time, the outside world began to understand the true nature of what was happening in the Mormon stronghold. Emma knew that the end was coming. Joseph's enemies were closing in, and his own followers were beginning to question the revelations that had once seemed so sacred. On June 23rd, he and his brother Hiram were arrested on charges of treason and taken to the jail in nearby Carthage. 2 days later, a mob stormed the jail. Emma heard the gunshots from her bedroom window, a series of sharp cracks that seemed to echo across the prairie, like the voice of divine judgment. When the news reached Nauvoo that evening, it came with the weight of finality. Joseph Smith, the prophet of God, was dead. Emma stood at her bedroom window as the sun set over Nauvoo, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded her of blood. In the distance, she could hear the sound of weeping, women mourning the loss of their prophet, children crying for a father figure who would never return. But Emma felt no tears, only a hollow emptiness where her faith had once resided. The hidden chamber beneath the mansion would be sealed now, its secrets buried with the man who had created them. The young women who had suffered within its walls would carry their scars in silence, their stories dismissed as the ravings of apostates and enemies of the faith. And the journal that had documented it all would disappear into history, its testimony lost to time, and the willful blindness of those who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But Emma knew that some secrets could never truly be buried. Somewhere in the darkness of human memory, the truth would survive. In the nightmares of the women who had endured Joseph's sacred ordinances, in the whispered warnings passed from mother to daughter, in the shadows that would forever haunt the places where innocence had been sacrificed on the altar of one man's unbridled appetites. As the last light faded from the sky, Emma Smith closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not to the God of her husband's revelations, but to whatever force in the universe might still care about justice for the innocent and punishment for the guilty. She prayed that someday, somehow, the full truth would come to light, and that the young women who had suffered in silence would finally find the peace that had been stolen from them in the name of celestial glory. The wind picked up, rattling the windows of the mansion and carrying with it the scent of approaching rain. In the distance, thunder rumbled like the voice of an angry heaven, and Emma Smith prepared to face whatever judgment awaited her in a world where the line between prophet and predator had been erased by the terrible weight of absolute power.